So many of you know that I've been attending a weekly Circle of Peace in St. Paul near my home for years. The circle begins with a shared dinner and then it's followed by a facilitated conversation. With the aid of a talking piece, participants take turns talking about their lives and concerns and frequently offering perspective on racial healing. As people share their stories, they build relationships, and often they inspire one another into deeper engagement and other activities promoting racial healing. So last week, Russell, the circle keeper, posed a question that asked, how are you or things different in your life due to the pandemic? The answers I heard more than once were people who said they're isolating. Now they go out less, they feel more introverted. And the other was that some people said, and bless their hearts for being so honest, you can tell this circle is real, they said that they become lazy, not their word, not mine, that they're inclined to stay home playing games, lounging around, procrastinating versus engaging in life and moving things forward. Last week, as we gathered for the Congregational Forum with Katie Johnson, our board president, I felt it was important for us to acknowledge the context of these past few years and the toll that they have taken, not just on us as individuals, but also on society as a whole and the institutions that we depend on, such as this congregation. It's not like things were rosy prior to the pandemic. A presidency like no other in our lifetime created a government that shook the foundation of every branch and enabled and legitimized a visible nationalist movement with values and goals that are counter to our faith. And now, as Kelly Clement spoke of last week, women in many states across America no longer have the autonomy over their own pregnancies. I'll stop there. We know the list. But I want you to realize that this is part of our current context. We really can't talk about anything without also acknowledging that. It's not a neutral backdrop to our lives. And so we need to just keep bring it forward. So how do we find strength and hope amidst the malaise and the inward turning of the past few years? How do we face and engage the great unknown in our country, in our world, in our congregation, and in our own lives? I find Valerie's metaphor of the pain-filled transitions of birthing really helpful. And hopefully the guys in this room do as well. I think she did a great job creating that connection to people soldiering on, and that, many of us haven't soldiered on, but we can imagine what that means, what that's nodding towards. She makes no false optimistic promises of ease or even a surety as we birth a new time and potentially a new country, but I'm siding with her. I'm siding with her. I need people who remind me of the courage to do something, to be part of what's going on. One might look at Valerie on the screen with her words not exactly queuing up and come up with our own assumptions about her. I certainly did. My assumption was that she likely came from parents who immigrated to the United States. Given how articulate she was, I imagined she came from parents who were also in the professions. But that assumption is wrong. Her family settled as Sikh farmers in Clovis, California in 1913. That is where she was born and raised on American soil with American roots. However, when you are Black or brown skinned in America, your lineage doesn't protect you from the prejudice and hate. She speaks of microaggressions that started at a young age and how they shook her from that safety of that land that she grew up on. But it really was the murder of a friend of hers, one that she calls Uncle, that shifted her work from that of a lawyer to an activist, a writer, and a prophetic speaker. The first person killed in a hate crime after 9/11 was Balbir Singh Saudi. a Sikh entrepreneur, a father who was murdered in front of his own store in Mesa, Arizona, by a man who called himself a patriot. Valerie reflects, I was going to be an academic, but his murder made me an activist. I joined a generation of Sikh and Muslim Americans fighting for our communities, fighting hate violence on the street, fighting policies by the state, and soon I realized that our liberation is bound up with one another. The metaphor she uses, this giving birth, the labor, the ring of fire that is so painful, but also a prelude to life, is so apt. There is not one among us who would say these past years have been easy or pain-free. And as a predominantly white congregation, we don't know the depth of the pain that has been experienced by our siblings of color. These past years have felt painful, exhausting, disorienting, and so long. And we have seen the birth of many beautiful things as well. We have greater trans visibility. A young woman of color as a Black poet during Biden's inauguration, saying a poem about America. We have beautiful young women of color assuming roles in government. We have so many people of all different ages and ethnicities who were in the streets after the election of 2016 and after the murder of George Floyd. And it wasn't a passive way of being in the streets. It was passionate, and it was diverse, and it was beautiful. Now that history is part of us. We can tap into that if we choose. We can tap into that history. If we allow it, it breathes life into this time. Carr says the greatest social reformers in history grounded entire movements in the ethic of love. And if we reclaim love through a feminist lens, then love can be seen as a sort of birth labor, fierce, bloody, imperfect, but life-giving. As I mentioned, she was a lawyer in 9/11, and as she looks back, she said, I'm a lawyer, and for so long, I couldn't even use the word love. Isn't that interesting how that rational mind and heart is often so divided? She said, I couldn't even use the word love. Now, she's the queen of revolutionary love. Carr's love isn't one from Valentine's Day or from rom-coms. No, she says that love is more like a feeling, is more than a feeling. She said love is a form of sweet labor, fierce, bloody, as I mentioned, imperfect, life-giving, a choice we make over and over again. If love is sweet labor, love can be taught, modeled, and practiced. This labor engages all of our emotions. Joy is the gift of love. Grief is the price of love. Anger protects that which is loved. And when we think we have reached our limit, wonder is the act that returns us to love. Valerie gives us 3 practices to focus on with this labor of love and transformation. And I want to just add a 4th because, that's the way I am. So let me start with the 4th, and then we will return to hers. I believe a critical practice is being willing and open to being changed. Think of her saying she was a lawyer who couldn't even use the word love, and now she's got a revolutionary love website and has written books about revolutionary love. I think it's really easy to assume that who we are right now is all we will ever be. It's what we will be in the future, that our circumstances are static. What is. But we've been given a lifetime to live, as long or as short as that may be, and lifetimes are unpredictable. Our work is to be open and responsive, to be changed, to be willing to be changed throughout all of our precious years on Earth. I often forget that. I don't know what that is about humans, but I often forget that this is not a static moment in life. So now on to Valerie's 3 practices. They are see no stranger, tend to the wound, and breathe and push. So let's just start with the see no stranger. This idea goes back to biblical times with story of Jesus and his apostles, seeing the other as oneself. Think about the story of the Good Samaritan or Jesus washing the feet of women that others deemed as sinful. As Carr says, all the great wisdom traditions of the world carry a vision of oneness, the idea that we are interconnected and interdependent, that we can look upon the face of anyone on any, and say as a spiritual declaration and a biological fact, you are a part of me I do not yet know. That's a hard one to swallow, but she means it when she says, see no stranger, and that we are interconnected. We are all part of one another, whether we want to admit it or know it or not. In this time of great division, it's really easy to take entire groups of people and see them as the other, to dehumanize them. I know I'm guilty of that. Carr says it's up to us to fight that instinct and instead change how we see, to expand the circle of who we see as one of us. The ancient tradition of storytelling is a path towards this goal. Carr says, drawing close to another person's stories, listening to their stories, turns them into us. So I ask you, she said, whose stories have we not heard? Whose stories we hear determine whose grief we will let into our hearts. Who have you not yet grieved with? Because who you grieve with, who you sit with and weep with determines who you organize with and who you will fight for. So how can you use your pen, your voice, your art to show up in places you haven't yet begun to fight with in solidarity? So next Sunday, as I mentioned, we're going to know some stories. We'll come to know stories of families that arrive in our country seeking safety and a new life. We'll hear from the UU Service Committee about their sanctuary work, and then we'll hear from an organization called Al Otro Lado, an organization which helps families on the ground in the United States with legal services and other resources they need to create a life here. The family from Guatemala that we are supporting in collaboration with the UU Church of Minnetonka will be there as well. So I hope you'll come and maybe shift some of your sense of others to see the stranger. The next practice, she said, is to heal the wound. And Carr says it's tempting to see our opponents as evil, but she says, I have learned that there are no such things as monsters in this world, only human beings who are wounded, people whose insecurities, anxieties, or greed or blindness cause them to hurt us. Our opponents are people who don't know what else to do with their insecurity but to hurt us, to pull the trigger or to cast the vote or to pass a policy aimed at us. But if some of us begin to listen to their stories, we can begin to hear underneath these slogans and sound bites, we can begin to understand how to defeat the cultural norms and institutions that radicalize them. She is optimistic, but it's good to hear it. Loving our opponents is not just moral, she says, it's pragmatic. It is strategic. It focuses us not just on removing bad actors, but birthing a new world for all of us. And I do realize that's easier said than done. I don't have easy access to people who I am in opposition to in terms of my values and belief, but I do have some access. And what if I was brave enough to hear their stories? What if instead of listening to reasons to support what's wrong with them, I was listening for, what happened to you? What happened to you? What is the source of your pain and your anger and your fear? Scary, I know, but I believe it is possible, perhaps not with the most extreme nationalists, but surely with the people in our lives who are more in the middle and kind of struggle, are torn on issues that are part of this America culture war. And Valerie reminds us that this practice also requires that we tend to our own wounds. She suggests that we find safe containers to work through our own grief and rage, so that our pain doesn't turn into more violence directed outward or inward. A community like this is at one place that it's healthy to do that work. We need communities of love and openness, forgiveness, of grace, of beauty, no matter how we show up. And honestly, I mean it, no matter how we show up. We don't have to show up perfect here. We can show up struggling here. We know we belong, and we can be our authentic, forever changing selves here. And finally, the last practice she has is the title of my sermon, Breathe and Push. As a proud feminist and daughter and mother, she says our social justice leaders, Gandhi, King, Mandela, they tell us a lot about how to love others and our opponents, but not so much about how to love ourselves. This is a feminist intervention, she says. For far too long, women and women of color specifically have been told to suppress our rage and grief in the name of love and forgiveness. No more. The movement can no longer happen on our backs or over our dead bodies. The midwife tells us to breathe and then to push. Not to breathe once and then push the rest of the way. No, she says to breathe and push, then breathe again. All of our labors, the labors of raising a family, of making a movement, of birthing a new nation, we need people to help us breathe and push into the fire of our bodies and into the fire of the world. I can't stress this breathe and push enough. As I was writing this sermon, that side panel, I saw it happen during her little, her words, popped onto my screen. I hate that thing. I don't know how to turn it off. And I wish that I was wise enough not to look. But instead, I quickly reviewed the headlines, and after reading just 4 headlines, I could feel my breathing change. My heart rate increased, my breathing became shallow, and I literally felt a bit of dizziness. This is just reading 4 headlines. All of that in a flash. I was triggered into that feeling of despair that is in me and that is constantly fighting for my attention. This is how real things are these days, and how vulnerable and permeable we are to the barrage of headlines that are just one click away. We should not respond in such a way to what is happening in the world. No, would not respond to what is happening in the world if we shut down. If I just stayed in that panic mode, I would do nothing. Honestly, I would do nothing. Maybe cry a little, probably eat, do something to comfort myself. But Carr says, I thought my breathlessness was a sign of my weakness. And a wise friend told me what I wish to tell you. Your breathlessness is a sign of your bravery. It means you are awake to what is happening right now. The world is in transition. As I think of that morning and that darn news panel flashing, I'm wondering if you would just join me in one moment singing that song we just sang, After Our Joys and Sorrows, When I Breathe In. We'll do it twice, once with Bruce and the piano and once without. When I breathe in, I breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I breathe out love. When I breathe in, I breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I breathe out love. Kerr says, and so I ask you, how are you breathing right now? Who are you breathing with? Breathe with the earth and the sea and the sky. Breathe with music and movement and meditation every day. Breathe to summon the ancestors at our backs, for when we breathe, we let in joy, we let in love. She said that we are the midwives in this time of great transition, tasked with the birthing of a future for all of us. If love is labor, says Carr, then love can be practiced, love can be modeled, love can be taught. So what does it mean to practice love when we are tired and we're growing numb? How do we keep showing up for the labor? The opposite of love is not rage, she said. The opposite of love is indifference. Love engages all of our emotions. Joy is the gift of love. Grief is the price of love. Anger is the force that protects that which is love. We can't access the depth of loving ourselves or others without our rage. So let this be a community that keeps calling you out of apathy and fear and isolation, maybe even some laziness, as my circle friends described. Let this be a place where you are called into love and some type of action in this continuous labor and transition. I have a few ideas. First, if you find yourself engaging in some act, small or large, that is part of this labor of love, I invite you to share it during joys and sorrows. I'll try to remember to tickle that response. We need to hear from others. We need to be motivated by others, and I invite you to be that for one another in this community. I also invite you, if you want to lead a discussion, a book read, a video, a viewing of something that moved you, or plan a visit like the sacred sites tours of the indigenous sacred sites of the Twin Cities, consider doing so. Just do it, come talk to me. Make sure that, we have a chance to look at calendars and find the right time and how to engage with others. I'm always willing to support any of you in this form of shared ministry. She actually wrote a really cool book that I was like, oh, that would be awesome. It's the one that hits on these different practices. So none of these would be long-term commitments. Instead, they can be done like these type of little experiences that can fit in with this large arc of our congregational values in the UU faith. I also want you to consider staying and being part of our sparklit conversations at the end of the services, where we go deeper and we listen to what is on each other's hearts. That's a practice that's really helpful as we try to keep moving through this labor. And finally, I want to just encourage you to find ways to engage in this tender experiment of democracy that is not done. That can be on your own or through this congregation, though honestly, we could still use people helping organize those efforts. So take a breath. Feel yourself alive in your body and in this community of love, and ask yourself what you can do at this moment in time to bring love and connection that is so desperately needed in this world. Breathe in peace, breathe out love, and be part of this great labor of a new America. May it be so. And amen.